Today I was kind of curious about this paper that I read a few years ago while I was doing my undergraduate work. So before 2019, at some point, I actually was never asked to read this or anything like that for any kind of class. This is a philosophy of mind work by, as you can see, Paul Churchland. And the reason why this paper has always been in my mind is because at this point, I was tutoring philosophy for the athletic department at my university. And one of the athletes that I was tutoring was assigned this paper. As you can see, it says here that this work here that I have pulled up, it was published in a contemporary introduction to the philosophy of mind. And so this is philosophy of mind. This is a philosopher's attempt not to do psychology, which is where it differs, right? But to talk about the methods, the viable methods of inquiry into the human mind. And so that's primarily the difference between, philosophy and psychology, whereas psychology uses, both empirical and subjective data to try to understand the mind, right? As it differs from the brain, as we can see, right? As we will see, especially with Churchland's, division between the mind and the brain, what he's calling a neuroscience, right? A neuroscience as opposed to what he calls folk psychology, right? Because of his criticisms on the branch itself. So, if you guys are psychology buffs, if you guys, enjoy, or you guys actually have made a career out of it, or hoping to make a career out of this psychology, right? This should be interesting to you guys, because it really lays down a critique, and maybe you'll find it plausible or convincing, whatever, on psychology. Right, it's going to criticize psychology, and so last time I did the stream, I looked at Schopenhauer's critique of Christianity's condemnation of suicide, right? And during that stream, I showed a little clip of Peterson, the Canadian psychologist Peterson, who was talking about suicide as this almost incomprehensible, condition or act brought about by unknown conditions, or conditions that we do not fully understand or we haven't fully grasped. And so I found that, that claim, and in that part, he was talking a little bit about his personal experience with it. And, that's fine as far, because it served my purpose of sort of giving you guys this idea that we really don't know what causes it, right? And the point there was that the mind, or the psyche, right, the non-material part of the brain, what we constitute the brain, we don't really understand it, right? We don't really understand it in its fullness, and that's exactly Churchland's point here. Why don't we? Should we be understanding it? And will psychology be eliminated, right? Hence the theory here, be eliminated by a more material and concrete understanding of the brain. And here he's going to argue that it can't merely be subsumed. Psychology can't merely be, sublated, folded into neuroscience. Rather, neuroscience is actually going to take the role of completely eliminating psychology as a science. And this paper is quite short, as you can see. It's 4 pages with 2 columns each. It's not that in depth, and it actually is very is written very, in a way that can be understood by people who are not in the field. So, like, including myself, I myself am not in psychology of mind. I am not a psychology person, right? I'm not into, I don't study psychology. If I did at some point, I probably did as a very early undergrad, right? When we all take that introduction to psychology course as part of our liberal arts degrees or something like that, right? Our health science degrees, perhaps. So that's probably one way in which I took an intro to psychology course. But other than that, I'm not in the field. So, and this was pretty straightforward. He gives a few examples of certain, sciences or certain beliefs that we had that sort of were done away with. And he says, the history of science itself shows that science doesn't exactly build on, right, the foundations of its past. Instead, it uses those as stepping stones to a different plane, not necessarily a higher plane under the same foundations, right? So this is when he's going to point to astronomers who look at the skies and determine that earlier theories were completely wrong, right? Especially the really, really ancient ones, like the pre-Socratic ideas that thought of certain elements as grounding and structuring the universe. So anyway, not to digress too much, hopefully this stuff is of interest to you guys. And, if you pop in and you're wondering what the heck I'm talking about, just go ahead and, drop a comment. Let me know, firstly, how or why you're interested in this kind of thing. If you're not, but, as I've been talking, you're sort of intrigued by it, that's cool too. But mostly this will probably, poke at a few people who already have sort of this trust, confidence, sort of a love affair, an attachment to psychology as a field, as a profession, maybe as just one of those knowledge quirks that some people have. Some people are just history buffs for the sake of history. Some people are psychology buffs for the sake of psychology, right? We watch psychological thrillers, we watch documentaries, and all of the sorts of things that relate to psychology. And and nobody blames you guys. It's it's interesting stuff. And I myself do not believe exactly as Churchland believes, primarily because I'm not a materialist. Right, I'm not a materialist because I do believe that ideas, that humans are guided by ideas, right? That individuals make choices based on non-material realities that are real enough to produce material change in the world, and therefore I consider them real, right? Sort of like the idea of freedom, right? The idea of freedom motivates human action to a degree that to say that the idea in the sense of idealism, right, isn't real, isn't true, is sort of already nonsensical, just because humans are of a particular type of being, right? But anyway, hopefully that's not a big distraction. But my views aside, I really just want to point to the text and sort of talk about what is going on, right? So he opens this little excerpt, right? This what little portion I do have that I brought up here, with this description here, quoting William Ramsay, right? And I'm not familiar with people in the field, neither psychologists, neurologists, or philosophers of mind for that matter, because again, I've been, in the last few years, just been studying German idealism and, slightly and slowly moving into theology and Jewish religion in the form just of Franz Rosenzweig, since I'm interested in his work. But anyway, this is the description that he gives, all right? Eliminative materialism. But wait, hold on. Before I do that, let me just check if the stream is working okay, if everybody can hear me, since I don't have any viewers here at this point. I'm gonna just double check on that and make sure everything's working. Yeah. Okay, so it seems like it is. I just pulled up my my own stream here, just to make sure. I'm new at this, so I really don't have any other obvious way to check this out. But anyway, he says, let me begin by reading this quote. He says, eliminative materialism is the radical claim that our ordinary common sense understanding of the mind is deeply wrong, and that some or all of the mental states posited by common sense do not actually exist. This is the initial claim, right? They don't exist, and what this is pointing to, like in common sense understanding of the mind and the mental states posited by this common sense, such as fear, love, whatever other emotion you can feel. Those things don't really exist. And the reason why they don't exist is because the materialist is going to believe that they are really just they can be understood completely through the chemical material, right? The physical makeup and undergoings of the brain as a physical process, right? Neurons, hormones, chemicals, receptors, this and that. Those things that are not so common sense, right, can really do away with the common sense understanding that we ordinarily carry, right, and have. And then he says, Descartes famously challenged much of what we take for granted, but he insisted that, for the most part, we can be confident about the content of our minds. And the reason why I highlighted that, if you guys are interested, Descartes, he's most famously known for his quote, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. And he says that in order to ground all of the rest of anything that he can know based on the fact that there's this one thing that he cannot doubt. And if he cannot doubt it, then it's a good place to start building knowledge upon that, right? So what he ended up saying is that he could not doubt his existence, therefore his own thinking is something of which he can be sure exists, right? And so the content of our mind is a little misleading there if you don't know Descartes and what Descartes is talking about. But either way, the point is being made. Eliminative materialists go further than Descartes, right? They go further on this point because they challenge the existence of the various mental states that Descartes took for granted. So like I explained on the part that I highlighted there in blue, it's not simply that I think, right, and that's the grounding force. It's actually different in the sense that Descartes took for granted that when we think, we have certain forms of thinking, and this is, of course, just Ramsey's here's claim. I'm not sure that I would agree with what they're saying there, but that's immaterial to the point they're going to be making, right? Because they're going to move on and say, we have to move beyond just the contents of our minds and start finding what really is going on that produces what is most commonsensical, right? And that's the materialist part there again. So, excuse me, after that quote, then Churchland begins. Excuse me, let me have a drink of water. Churchland begins, right? He begins with his own part of the essay here, and he says, as the eliminative materialist sees it, right? As we see it, as people in my camp see it, our common sense psychological framework is a false and radically misleading conception of the causes of human behavior and the nature of cognitive activity, right? So there's already the claim, right? There's already the big claim that he's sort of trying to do away with a thing that he's going to be challenging, right? He's trying to do away with this conception that psychology is adequately establishing the framework, right? The logical understanding, the scientific data that could help us really, really get down to understanding the causes of behavior, and also to explain the cognitive nature of, to explain the nature of cognitive activity, right? To explain the nature of this thinking mind, right? On this view, folk psychology is not just an incomplete representation of our inner natures. It is an outright misrepresentation of our internal states and activities. It is an outright misrepresentation of our internal states and activities, right? So whatever's going on in our mind, as psychology tries to, psychology or psychologists rather, try to use their methods to explain what's going on, they are actually misrepresenting what is actually happening. Okay, so there's the critique, and let's see if you guys agree with how he's going to defend that, right? So he says, consequently, we cannot expect a truly adequate neuroscientific account of our inner lives to provide theoretical categories that match up nicely with the categories of our common sense framework, right? So for my sake, let me read that again. He says, as a result, we cannot expect a truly adequate neuroscientific account of our inner lives to provide theoretical categories that match up nicely with the categories of a common sense framework. Okay, so because psychology is so inadequately addressing the realities and the causes of our behavior and the way we understand the cognitive framework of our brains, we cannot expect then to provide these, and he's saying categories, but really, let's say explanations for what's going on in our inner lives, right? In our mental minds, right? What's going on in the way that we experience the world in our heads. We cannot rely on psychology to bring about those answers, right? Those explanations. Accordingly, we must expect that the older framework will simply be eliminated, right? And that's why this theory, this idea here, is called eliminative materialism, right? Or eliminativism. Eliminativism. I like the full name better, right? Eliminative materialism, because it sort of highlights it also, the focus on the material, right? The physical, the brain. In the science, right, the neuroscience, as opposed to what he's calling the folk psychology. And so he says we must expect that the old framework will simply be eliminated rather than reduced by a matured neuroscience. Right, a matured neuroscience. And so something that we have to keep in mind here is that Churchland is writing in 1984, right? In 1984, he's writing that neuroscience will eventually replace, not evolve, not work with, not collaborate, none of those things, will completely and adequately, right, he believes, replace psychology and whatever psychology is doing and the answers that psychology had provided, right? He doesn't say that explicitly, but it's understood that if this is going to be a matter of replacing psychology, then anything that psychology had previously provided, given the reasons for the replacement, we cannot trust those answers. And so that's why he's saying replaced, right? Eliminated, right? And replaced. And then that's why he says it's rather than being reduced, right, by immature. So the older framework will simply be eliminated rather than be reduced, right? That's why reduced is in there, because he's not simply diminishing the role of psychology. He's completely eliminated. And so here he's going to give his historical parallels. He's going to give us the examples of other views that were ultimately done away with, right, that we no longer incorporate into our body of beliefs. In the given field, but rather they were like he believes psychology will be is just canned, right? Shit canned. So let's see if we can make sense of a few of his examples. Some of them are, some of them that you'd expect. If I could give my own example, just based on reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, when he talks about phrenology, right, the science of phrenology and how it impacts, the development of science and history and things like that. Well, phrenology is this thing where people had certain characteristics, right? And you could tell what those characteristics would be based on the shape of the skull, right? And so here, just a quick look up of phrenology, and I'll show you guys what that resulted in, is that Yeah, you guys can see that here. Phrenology, it's a branch of pseudoscience, right away. A branch of pseudoscience, an assertion of human characteristics based on the skull, right? Based on the skull. Phrenology comes from the ancient Greek phren for mind, and the logos, knowledge, right? Phrenology, logos, knowledge of the mind through the measurement of bumps on the skull to predict the mental traits. It's based on the concept that the brain is the organ of the mind, and that certain brain areas have, specific functions, and then therefore the size of those are going to relate to the outcome or the ability of that function to, display itself in a person's abilities and characters, right? Something like that. That's what it's going to continue saying. So, so phrenology, right? So when I read that work by Hegel, he writing in the early 1800s. It's laughable, and it's something that you just kind of like smirk at because, I can't believe they actually thought this crap, right? And so you wouldn't necessarily expect, you wouldn't necessarily expect somebody, we want to take seriously to have those views, the views on the science in that way, right? And so that's pretty funny. I think that's one example that hopefully brings what's going on to light, and brings up this historical parallel section to make more sense, right? And so he's saying, as the identity theorist can point to historical cases of successful inter-theoretic reduction, so the eliminative materialist can point to a historical case of the outright elimination of the ontology of an older theory, right? Of everything that the theory was, in favor of the ontology of a new and superior theory. So this is the case, right? This is why the history of science is important to Churchland, because it sort of demonstrates exactly the point that he's trying to make. Sciences die. Their body of knowledge dies with them, and newer, more, I don't want to say advanced, but in a way you would think of it as advanced because it's replacing what came before it. Science comes about, right? That is new and superior. Actually, he's making the claim that it's superior. So maybe advanced is the right word, so there we have it. So again, then he says, for the most of 18th and 19th century, people people believed that heat was a stable fluid held in bodies, much in the way that water is held in a sponge, right? So people believed back then that the heat in your body was this substance that could be extracted, right? Sort of like a sponge in the water. And let me keep going here. Let me get to the top. So that's what they believed, right? And so what they called it was this caloric, right? They called it this fluid was a substance they called caloric, and it flowed within the body or from one body to another, and how it produced a thermal expansion, melting, boiling, and so forth. So they had this whole thermal theory, right, of a heat, and they tried to explain everything with this first assumption that heat was this substance, right, that existed within a different or another body. Excuse me, but by the end of the last century, it had become abundantly clear that heat was not a substance at all, but rather heat was just the energy of motion in the trillions of jostling molecules that make up the heated body itself, right? There we have it. By the end of the last century, it just became clear that, they were mistaken. They were pretty wrong about that, right? They were wrong about the fact that he was this, that he was just substance, right, within things. It actually turned out to be that it was just a bunch of movements, right? A bunch of things moving and causing what we measure as heat and what we perceive as, with our senses as heat, more importantly. So it continues. The new theory, the kinetic theory, corpuscular theory of matter and here was much more successful than the old one in explaining and predicting the thermal behavior of bodies, right? That's the key. The new version was far more successful than the old one at doing what science ought to do. If something in science is considered valid, then it must be able to predict future outcomes, right? This is the prediction. This is the replication part of the scientific method, right? If you can reproduce an outcome, that means that you can predict it based on the knowledge you have, and therefore that knowledge becomes trustworthy. So that's what happened with this new kinetic theory, right? And then he says caloric was simply eliminated from our accepted ontology, right? This idea of heat being a substance like fluid, it was gone. It was kicked to the curb. And that's one historical example, right? And so he says the second example, it used to be thought that when a piece of wood bums or a piece of metal rust, a spirit-like substance called phlogiston was being released. Oh, well, now we would just laugh at that, right? Now we would just laugh at this garbage. Like, how is it that when metal's rusting, we perceive this thing as being released that we call phlogiston? But anyway, briskly in the former case, slowly in the latter. Okay, once gone, the notable substance left only a pile of ash or rust, right? This is what happens when things decayed, right? And so when things decayed, we did notice that their ultimate makeup was reduced to certain things like ashes or rust, right? And that's normal. It's just based on our observations, right? And it was at that point commonsensical to assume that something had left the body because a lot less is left of the wood once it completely decays, right? In this sense, becomes ash. Then we know that the weight is gone and there's a lot of things missing, right? So they guessed that phlogiston was leaving. It later came to be apprehended that both processes involve not the loss of something, but the gaining of a substance taken from the atmosphere, oxygen. In this case, yeah. So when iron gains oxygen through, in the case of rust, probably through water, right? Gaining oxygen. That's how rust came about, right? It was the gaining of this thing. So phlogiston emerged not as an incomplete description of what was going on, but as a radical misdescription. So he's saying this here because they believe that when iron began to rust, it was actually something was leaving the iron, where it turned out that something was being gained, right? And my example of the wood burning was just based on the pile of ash comment there, but in any way, I think the iron better exemplifies how this idea of phlogiston was incorrect, right? Phlogiston, therefore, was not suitable for reduction to or identification with some notion from within the new oxygen chemistry, and it was simply eliminated from the science, right? So it turned out that nothing that came from that idea, that theory, could be sublated, could be worked into this new version of what chemistry tried to do, right? And so instead, it was just done away with, as opposed to simply incorporated, right? Understood and built upon. And again, all of this at this point seems, well, duh. Obviously, science is going to leave behind the things that are erroneous. And if you're agreeing, then you just got to continue, continue applying the same train of thought. If these things are so obviously wrong and obviously correct for science to have developed in this way, then what's going to happen to psychology then? If psychology is as wrong as Churchland believes it is, then you wouldn't have any arguments there to defend it, right? So it says, admittedly, both of these examples concern the elimination of something non-observable, but our history also includes the elimination of certain widely accepted observables, right? So he's going to give you an example of something that was observed, not just things like oxygen atoms that we couldn't see, for example. So he says, before Copernicus' view became available, almost any human who ventured at night and could look up at the starry sphere of the heavens, and if that person stayed for more than a few minutes, he could, this person could also see that it turned around an axis through Polaris. What the sphere was made of, they guessed crystal, and what made it turn, again, they guessed the gods, was theoretical questions that exercised us for over 2 millennia. But hardly anyone doubted that the existence of what everyone could observe with their own eyes. In the end, however, we learned to reinterpret our visual experience experience of the night sky within a very different conceptual framework, and the turning sphere evaporated. Okay, so eventually we realized what the heck was going on. The crystal of which everything was made and it was just churning, right? We were picturing this crystal ball. Sort of that was done away with, as well as the gods, right? The gods being this moving force in the universe. So that was done away with as well, which is cool, right? And we accept that as now we accept that, right, as commonsensical. But you got to remember there was a point in time in which it was being contested. And science was doing its best to find the reliable answers. And by science, I mean the scientists, right? The individual scientists were doing their best to come to reinterpret what they were observing happen in the night sky. But there were, of course, other scientists who perhaps were not leaving behind these ideas, or were instead trying to reinterpret or reintegrate, fold into the new science something in particular, right? Some of these ideas and notions, right? So anyway, moving on. He says, witches provide another example. Psychosis is a fairly common affliction among humans, and in an earlier century, its victims were standardly seen as cases of demonic possession, as instances of Satan's spirit itself, glaring malevolently out at us from behind the victim's eyes. Right? We thought we knew that that we were interpreting this person's psychosis as a real expression of some kind of demonic possession, right? That witches exist was not a matter of controversy. No, that was taken as true. One would occasionally see them in a city or hamlet engaged in incoherent, paranoid, or even murderous behavior. But observable or not, we eventually decided that witches simply do not exist. We concluded that the concept of a witch is an element in a conceptual framework that misrepresents so badly the phenomena to which it was standardly applied that literal application of the notion should be predominantly withdrawn. In other words, we began to see these witches in their rituals and their visions, perhaps, right? Their visions, their connection to the occult, to the other world, etc., as being able to be understood as psychosis, right? As this condition of the mind that, although not completely understood, was a better explanation to why they had visions, to why they had these conversations, to why they had a character of being possessed, right, by otherworldly beings. And so he says, where did I leave off here? We concluded that the concept, right? Okay, so modern theories of mental dysfunction led to the elimination of witches from our serious ontology, right? So modern theories of mental dysfunction led to the elimination of witches from serious ontology. So let me give you guys a pretty sweet example of this. Give me just a sec. Let me look this up. Wow. I don't know, the myth of demonic possession. There's quite a bit on this. I'm not sure if this is this stuff is interesting. Quite a lot of video. I had never looked this up. It actually turns out there's quite a bit of things on here about The Exorcist. But anyway, I didn't prepare the clip, so I'm just going to skip it. I wanted you guys to show you the scene in The Exorcist when they're at the psychologist and neurology clinic with Reagan. Of course, this is in the early 70s. Exorcist, right, with Blair, and they asked the mom, you have any religious beliefs? It's time I think we look into psychiatry because there's really nothing wrong with your daughter. We've scanned her left and right. We've done everything we think. We thought it was a problem with her lobes in her brain, and it turns out that she's completely fine. It's time to look into this psychiatry business. And why did they do that? Right? Because they were aware that they were nothing else they could find physically with her, right? So they turned to the psychiatrist in it's sort of an opposite and demonstrated, contrary to what Churchland believed, right? They were actually heading in the wrong direction. But the psychiatrist says, we don't. Does your daughter having the religious beliefs because the person may be possessed, but it's not really possession. It's the belief in possession, they tell her, and the belief in an exorcism, which could get rid of her belief in being possessed. So I think that's a very interesting scene in how they handle all that, right? Because when the mom, right, Miss McNeil, she asks, you're telling me to take my daughter to a witch doctor, right? And they're like, well, yes, but after that, because they suggest that she takes the person to the priest, takes Reagan to the priest. You wanted me to see a witch doctor, right? And they're like, yeah, because if she truly believes she's possessed, and an exorcism would truly convince her that she's no longer possessed, and we'll fix her right up. But this is the scientist believing in the power of the brain's belief in possession as the diagnosis, but refusing to accept any actual case of demonic possession, right? So we could see how this Churchland's point here being made. So modern theories of mental dysfunction eliminated the witches from serious ontology. And so, interestingly enough, again in that movie, the priest tells Miss McNeil, Reagan's mom, the church is not going to authorize an exorcism. I can see her as a psychiatrist, but I can't see her as a priest. And she's like, this is bullshit. I taken her to see every doctor, and nobody's helping me, dude. Like, seriously help me. And the guy's like, I'll come see her, but I can't see her as a priest without the church and all this stuff. But anyway, it's a great movie. It's a great depiction of what's going on here, according to Churchland, in the way that science eventually left behind the belief in witches, right, in possession. Anyway, so he continues the concepts of folk psychology, the belief, desire, fear, sensation, pain, joy, and so on await a similar fate. The concepts, right? The explanation that psychologists give us about belief, desire, fear, sensation, pain, joy, all of these things, they are going to suffer from a similar fate according to the view at issue. According to materialism, according to eliminative materialism, we're going to leave behind what we believe we know and how we come to understand the commonsensical experience of belief, of fear, of our sensations, of pains and joys, and we will be able to reduce those to a material description of the neurological functionings and the chemical ongoings in our brain. Right. And when neuroscience has matured, and this is what he's saying, and when neuroscience has matured to the point where our poverty of our current conceptions is apparent to everyone and the superiority of the new framework is established, we shall then be able to set about the reconceiving of our internal states and activities within a truly adequate conceptual framework at last. Right. So when neuroscience has matured, and again, this is so materialist in the sense that you could see Marx here, right? You can see Marx not in the whole sociology, economic sense, right? But you can see Marx's teleology here, right? You can see Marx's, and by extension Hegel's primarily, but this logical progression, right, where reason is continually developing itself to further understand itself in a completely, according to Marx, material way, where we stop, for example, believing that the kingdom of God is coming, the rapture is coming for the church, and that all of pain and misery will be eliminated in the future. We're leaving all that stuff behind because we now have this material focus on our reality, which tells us logically that capitalism will come to an end, right? It's going to destroy itself with its contradictions. In the same way, that's the materiality that's going on here, right? When neuroscience has matured, telos, right? It's going towards a rational and logical end. And that's my connection there with why he's using materialism after eliminative, right? He's not just buying the eliminativism part. He's calling it eliminative materialism because of this when neuroscience has matured. And it's so, I'm going to read it all again just because this is the crux. This is the main part of this paper. And when neuroscience has matured to the point where the poverty of our current conceptions is apparent to everyone, and the superiority of the new framework is established, we shall then be able to set about the reconceiving our internal states and activities within a truly adequate conceptual framework at last. Our explanation of one another's behaviors will appeal to such things as our neuropharmacological states, the neural activity is specialized anatomical areas, and whatever other states are deemed relevant by our new theory. Our private introspection will also be transformed. And may be profoundly enhanced by reason of the more accurate and penetrating framework it will have to work with, just as the astronomer's perception of the night sky is much enhanced by the detailed knowledge of modern astronomical theory that he or she possesses. Okay, so perfect, right? We're going to be so much more advantaged by this new, better understanding, reinterpreting of our experiences, right? Reinterpreting what fear means, not as a subjective sensation, but as a neurological construct or activity of our brain, right? According to neuroscience. So we continue here. He says, the magnitude of the conceptual revolution has suggested this should not be minimized. Here suggested, not has suggested. Here suggested should not be minimized. It would be erroneous. And the benefits to humanity might be equally great if each of us is possessed an accurate neuroscientific understanding, what we now conceive dimly as the varieties and causes of mental illness, the factors involved in learning, the neural basis of emotions, intelligence, and socialization, then the sum total of human misery might be much reduced, right? So he's pointing out the benefits that we all gain from this process of elimination that goes on in the progression of science, the history of science, right? He's saying it's for the better, right? All of stuff is happening for the better and will happen as neuroscience matures, as neuroscience advances and replaces psychology, right? We will be able, right, to understand and treat the causes of mental illness, the factors involved in learning, the basis of emotions, intelligence, and socializations, and we'll be able to manage them much better than we do today through what he calls folk psychology, right? And right here where he's talking about neuropharmacological states, that's just a hint at the trust in my view, right, in my reading anyway, the trust that neurology will have on medicine to alter the states and the contents of the brain matter to produce a different sensation of experience, namely going from pain to joy, from depression to happiness, etc. Right? That's my interpretation of that part anyway. So let's go on here. He says, arguments for eliminative materialism. Let me jump ahead then, just so we don't take too much longer. I'm reaching, the hour here, and I don't want to don't want to go over an hour because these are already getting pretty long as it is. So let me go ahead and go down all the way to arguments against materialism. Right? He's going to give us a few reasons why some of the opposition to these things are interesting. Right? The focus, again, is whether the concept of folk psychology will find vindicating matchups in matured neuroscience. The eliminative bets no. Oh, this is interesting. This is interesting, and I highlighted it because he's making the other claim here. And I know I wanted to move on, but I did highlight this for a reason, right? He says a third argument attempts to find an a priori advantage for eliminative materialism over the identity theory and functionalism. It attempts to counter the common intuition that eliminative materialism is distantly possible, perhaps, but is much less probable than either the identity theory or functionalism. The focus again is on whether the concepts of folk psychology will find vindicating matchups in mature neuroscience. So the argument there, the argument here is that some people claim that neuroscience will eventually just confirm some of the doings of psychology, right, and sort of vindicate psychology. He says no, right? He says no. He says we're leaving it behind. We're finding a better way to understand these things, such that we can leave behind what psychology produced, even if it seems as though they were on the right track, given neuroscience's answers, right? So he says arguments against eliminative materialism. The initial plausibility that this rather radical view is low for almost everyone, since it denies deeply entrenched assumptions. That is at best a question-begging complaint, of course, since those assumptions are precisely what is at issue. But the following line of thought does not attempt to mount a real argument. Eliminative materialism is false, runs the argument. Okay, so this is the argument, right? Eliminative materialism is false because one's introspection reveals directly the existence of pains, beliefs, desires, fears, and so forth, right? So this is one of the arguments that he's answering to, and the argument is saying that we clearly experience in introspection, pain, beliefs, fears, and so forth, right? They're clearly real experiences, right? And materialism is false because it tries to do what? Reinterpret those real feelings of pain as neurological states, right? So he's saying their existence is as obvious as anything could be. The eliminative materialist will reply that this argument makes the same mistake that an ancient or medieval person would be making if he insisted that he could just see with his own eyes that the heavens from a turning sphere or that witches exist, right? So that's the argument. That's the argument being made against eliminative materialism. And he answers in this way. He says, the fact is, all observation, let me see, I'll try to get out of the way here so we can read all of it here. It says, the fact is, all observation occurs as good as the conceptual framework in which they are expressed. In 3 cases, the starry sphere, which is in the familiar mental states, precisely what is challenged is the integrity of the background conceptual framework. And I hear I can't really get out of the way too much here. Let me move the webcam back over here. Yeah, there we go. So he says, in all 3 cases, right? In all 3 cases, the heavens, the witches, and the familiar mental states like fear and hope, and the ones mentioned above, desires, pains, beliefs, right? So in all 3 cases, precisely what is challenged is the integrity of the background conceptual framework in which the observation judgments are expressed. To insist on the validity of one's experiences, traditionally interpreted, is therefore, and let me go now this way and move the camera back, is therefore to beg the very question at issue. For in all 3 cases, the question is whether we should reconceive the nature of some familiar observational domain. And so what the answer for him is simple. He's saying we're not doing away with those experiences. We're not saying that those things aren't real. We are saying that they are, and we should reconceive the nature of them as neurological, as opposed to something subjective, right? Something that is only there as a wheel, as a gear in the mind, right? The psyche. And then he says, the second criticism attempts to find an incoherence in the eliminative materialist position. The bald statement of eliminative materialism is that the familiar mental states do not really exist. But that statement is meaningful, runs the argument, only if it is the expression of a certain belief and an intention to communicate and a knowledge of the language and so forth, right? So The argument they're saying that eliminative materialists don't believe that those mental states exist, right? But at the same time, they're experiencing a belief, which they say that doesn't exist, right? If the statement is true, then no such mental state exists, and the statement is therefore meaningless string of marks or noises that cannot be true, right? So in other words, they're claiming that people like Churchland, are believing that beliefs don't exist, but by believing that, they believe nothing, right? And so that's they're incoherent in this way. Evidently, the assumption that eliminative materialism is true entails that it cannot be true, right? It's like saying beliefs are not true, and I believe that. Okay, that's what they're claiming that this position is. And so let's see his answer. He says, the whole in this argument is a premise concerning the conditions necessary for a statement to be meaningful. It begs the question, if eliminative materialism is true, then meaningfulness must have some different source. To insist on the old source is to insist on the validity of the very framework at issue. Again, a historical parallel may be helpful here. Consider the medieval theory that being biologically alive is a matter of being ensouled by the immaterial spirit. And consider the following response to someone who has expressed this belief in that theory. My learned friend has stated that there is no such thing as a spirit, but this statement is incoherent. For if it is true, then my friend does not have a spirit and must therefore be dead. But if he is dead, then his statement is just a string of noises devoid of meaning and truth. Evidently, the assumption that anti-vitalism is true entails that it cannot be true. So he explained the argument, and he explained it as being sort of nonsensical because it's based on a contradiction of descriptions, a contradiction of terms, not a contradiction in their position, right? If in fact you reinterpret belief as something other than what the subjective person believes it to be, then the problem goes away, right? The problem only exists if you analyze the position of the eliminative materialists. If you judge their view based on accepting the views they're trying to do away with, right? They're trying to do away with the belief that belief is merely something tied to like the emotional belief, the psychological definition of what a belief is. And so you can't judge my definition based on your answer to what belief is, because my network, my concept is doing away completely with your definition. Right. This is why he gave the example of the person that doesn't believe in the spirit. Right. If some person doesn't believe in the spirit within the body that gives it life, to say that then you're dead is to not understand the idea that we're doing away with this concept of the spirit to begin with. And if I do away with that, I'm no longer dead if I don't believe in it, because that definition is gone for me. It doesn't exist. Right. I now have a better understanding of what gives me life. And that new understanding of what gives me life keeps me alive while I say that I don't have a spirit. Right. That's what he did in that last answer, right? So he says, a final criticism draws a much weaker conclusion, but makes a rather stronger case. Eliminative materialism, this is the argument, is making of mountains out of molehills. It exaggerates the defects in folk psychology, right? So in other words, psychology isn't as useless as you make it seem. And it underplays the real success of psychology, right? So this is where the psychologists, the psychology buffs would say, come on, man, psychology, we're not doing that bad. We are actually finding answers, right? We're solving real world problems. And then he says, perhaps the arrival of a mature neuroscience will require the immolation of the occasional folk psychological concept, continues the criticism, and a minor adjustment in certain folk psychological principles may have endured, right? So perhaps when neuroscience matures to the point that you claim as an eliminative materialist, psychology will be all for the better, right? And then you say, but the large-scale elimination forecast by the eliminative materialist is just an alarmist worry or a romantic enthusiasm, right? A romantic enthusiasm. So that's the claim. That's the claim against, right? This is the final criticism. They're saying, well, you're just enamored with your own view. You don't understand that things build on each other and that your neuroscience will feed into an adequate description an adequate understanding of these psychological concepts that perhaps we haven't been able to answer, but with the help of neuroscience, we will be able to answer. So perhaps this complaint is correct, he says, right? This is Churchland saying, yeah, perhaps that's correct. And perhaps it is merely complacent. Whichever, it does bring out the important point that we do not confront two simple and mutually exclusive possibilities here. Pure reduction versus pure elimination. Rather, these are endpoints of a smooth spectrum of possible outcomes between which there are mixed cases of partial elimination and partial reduction, right? Only empirical research can tell us where on that spectrum our own case will fall. So this is what he's saying. It may, there is this spectrum, there is this way in which elimination comes about, right? And he says, perhaps we should speak here more literally of revisionary materialism instead of concentrating on the more radically possible of the across-board elimination, right? So here he sort of does say, I'm defending the position as an extremist, but I have to give some credibility to the idea that science evolves on the spectrum, right? And we shall see only in the future how this will come about. And he says, perhaps we should, but it has been my aim in this section to make it at least intelligible to you that our collective conceptual destiny lies substantially towards the revolutionary end of the spectrum, right? So I'm on the latter camp. I am more for elimination, but the process through which we get to that eliminative process, right, is up for grabs in the future, right? We shall see how it comes about. But he's saying in this paper, I am presenting the arguments, taking the rather, what word does he say? The collection of destiny lies substantially towards the revolutionary end of the spectrum, right? So towards the right side. And it's funny that he uses the word revolutionary end here because, again, like I was pointing out earlier, the materialist's definition here, being a philosopher, does come from, sort of this Marxist spirit and hints, right? So that's funny to see him use the word revolutionary in their form. And yeah, so we've reached the end of the paper, right? Hopefully y'all enjoyed what this was. You enjoyed this perspective. It's nothing crazy. It's nothing that we don't observe science do when they come about and say that something has allowed us to reinterpret what we always believed. Unfortunately, we're at a point where we believe that the science is settled, and questioning the science is sort of a political claim as opposed to a one of skepticism that is warranted in the scientific method and process. So this whole paper you can take just as a general critique of the process by which science develops, but also I think it's important to put it to work in the way that current science, the scientific consensus, is sort of aligned politically in some cases, and it gives us an ability to have fresh eyes and look at our current, our current culture and our current relationship to science, right? To science as something worth scrutinizing, right, and critiquing. So, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you guys are into philosophy of mind, psychology, and if you guys are into neuroscience. That's a big pill to swallow, just because of the level of education and being in the field that it takes to consider oneself a neuroscientist. But sometimes, you can, like I said, be a history buff, be a neurology buff, and, all these different kind of interests exist out there. So if you're one of those people, let me know, hit me up, let me know what you thought about this paper. I don't know if there is an updated, sort of essay based on eliminative materialism. I don't know where into it developed here after 1984. Because this is something that I found interesting, that I wanted to read, that I've read in the past, and I haven't really kept up with it all too much. So if it has developed and it went somewhere else, Yeah, please let me know, share it with me. We'll take a look at it, and maybe we can do a follow-up to this, depending on, the response that I get from it. So anyway, thanks for joining me. I hope you have a great one. We'll see you on the next one.